Have you ever read a research article where the findings seem interesting, but the methods section left you with more questions than answers? Have you ever wondered how much detail is really necessary to convince readers that your qualitative research is rigorous and credible? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we'll unpack why a clear, detailed, and transparent methods section is essential to building trust with your reader. I'll walk you through what reviewers and editors are looking for and how to avoid the most common traps that weaken good qualitative work. Let's dive in. Many years ago, I was reviewing an article for a journal. And so as I oftentimes do whenever I'm reviewing, the first thing that I always look at before anything else is I look at the methods section. And the reason for that is because it doesn't really matter to me how well constructed your literature review is. It doesn't really matter what findings you say that you have. If the methods section of your project doesn't show me that you've carefully and rigorously analyzed your data, then the rest of it is meaningless, right? Because the method section is what is convincing me as a reader that you followed some sort of procedures, you did some sort of analysis that was more than just cherry picking what you thought was interesting or haphazardly looking through the data, but instead you followed some procedure that then allowed you to come up with some sort of insights that we wouldn't have had you not engaged in this analysis. So I flipped to the methods section of this paper, and lo and behold, there's not really anything there. The author describes a couple of texts that they've read, but I don't really know what the unit of analysis is, why they chose those texts, why they did this type of analysis rather than that type of analysis. And so I write all this into my review, send it in to the editor to give back to the author, and I recommend rejection. 6 months later, I get the article again. I guess the editor wanted to give it another chance. And in the cover letter that the author has written back to the reviewers, they've stated, critical discourse analysis is more of a methodological perspective, not really a method. And so the reviewers' request to know exactly what I've done in order to execute my analysis are improper. First off, that's just simply not true. Anyone who's done any sort of critical discourse analysis research knows that the method section is where you describe all of the things that you did in your data gathering and your data analysis techniques. So this person's just wrong. But that leads to the second point, which is at that point, again, I am left as a reader with very little to recommend me to read the rest of the article, because if this person is saying to me, I don't want to show you the steps that I took in order to generate this thing that we are going to call knowledge, that we are going to say is more than just conjecture or assumption or belief or feeling or intuition, but this is actual research, and I'm not going to show you the step-by-step way in which I did that, then I have very little confidence that what you've produced is actual research, and thus I have very little reason to recommend publication. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about what then is a good method section. Now, there are different types of method sections for different types of research. Today, I'm going to focus on qualitative research for a few reasons. First, that is my main area of expertise, so I feel like I'm the most knowledgeable on that. But second, because I feel like, much like this author that I reviewed, sometimes I think that qualitative researchers don't feel the need to be as methodologically rigorous in describing how they did things because there's not the same set of standards and procedures that are in quantitative literature. And so as a result, they kind of wave their hands away as, oh, well, it's just a methodological perspective. It's not really a method. I don't have to do things in some sort of step-by-step fashion. And while that's true in some types of qualitative literature, a lot of qualitative literature does have a sort of social science bent to it. Thus, it needs to have those traditional practices that would indicate to me as a reader that what we are doing here is rigorous research. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what makes a compelling, strong, qualitative research method section. So let's dive in. Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. Hi, my name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor at the University of Northern Iowa. I've written dozens of articles, books, chapters, and essays, as well as edited some of the top journals in my discipline. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea. Now, before I go on, I do want to note again, because I can already hear some listeners who are qualitative scholars saying to me, qualitative is not quantitative. We don't have the same sort of criteria that quantitative people do. We don't have the same standards of validity, reliability, and our method sections, if we even have them, don't all need to be uniform. And yes, that is absolutely true. But again, oftentimes I find that a lot of qualitative research does take on this more social science type of writing genre. And as a result, your writing needs to then showcase that type of writing. If you're doing something like autoethnography, my story, narrative-driven research, or ethnographic research, the idea of having a traditional social science method section is preposterous, right? I sometimes get, usually from graduate students or early career writers, I'll review a submission that is an ethnography, for example, but it has a formal method section. I mean, that's a misapprehension of what type of audience that you are writing to. Because if you are an autoethnographer and you write a traditional social science method, every autoethnographer is going to absolutely hate that because that's not the genre in which they write in. So you've alienated that group of people already because you've indicated to them that the genre in which they write, which is in many ways a reaction to that social science approach, is wrong because you've engaged in it, right? So you've basically ceded the rhetorical ground that autoethnography is a method unto itself with its own logics by having to poach or borrow the logics of writing from social science. You're also not going to impress any social scientist by having that method section, because if you're writing an autoethnography, you have an N of 1. So no social scientist is going to look at that and go, oh, well, but they had a formal method section, so that makes this good social science research. It's not good social science research because it's not social science. It's a completely different genre. It needs to be evaluated on a different set of logics of narrative coherence, fidelity, credibility, those sorts of things, not on logics of social scientific writing genres. So in this case, though, we're going to focus on a more social science form of qualitative research. So whenever I'm giving advice either to clients or to students, I typically look for 5 things in a qualitative methods section. Now, of those 5 things, 3 things always need to appear. 2 of them, as we're going to talk about, sometimes need to appear. So we're going to focus on the first 3 because they're the most important, but then we'll also talk about the other ones, okay? So the first one is participants or artifacts. This is either who did you get data from or what were the artifacts that you had of study. So if you're doing human subjects research, the first thing that I should see in this section is that you tell me that you have IRB approval in order for you to conduct your study. Some journals demand that you have your institutional ID for the form that you filled out for your IRB. Some just want to see you say, I received IRB approval. But either way, I'm looking to make sure that you actually do have that approval if you are using human participants. And then I want to know, what were your sampling techniques? Did you have simple random sampling, systematic random sampling? Did you have a single site? Did you have multiple sites? I need to know what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are for your participants. Do they have to fit certain demographic profiles? Do they have to earn so much or be of a certain race or ethnicity? I need to know what you did in order to get this sample. So did you use snowball techniques? Did you have a Facebook post? Did you post a call for participants at like your local library? What did you do in order to obtain this sample of folks? And then I need to know their demographics. I should be able to see breakdowns of race, gender, socioeconomic status, grade level, or whatever it might be. If they work for a company and that's important to your research design, then you might say how large the company is that they are. Is it a Fortune 500 company, a mom and pop business? But all of these things point to you showing me as a reader that the sample that you have was obtained in a way that is as rigorously done for the types of knowledge claims that you are going to make. Now, I say it like that because oftentimes in qualitative research, since we are not looking for generalizability, the idea of having a random sample is less important to us oftentimes. And that being said, there is a difference between having a purposive sample where you are looking for specific characteristics and a convenience sample where you just go out and find whatever Tom, Dick, or Harry is out on the street and interview them or whatever it might be in order just to have a higher N for your study. A convenience sample is the lowest form of research that we can do. And although it's better than nothing, it's not great. But sometimes having a purposive sample means that we have to eschew doing more rigorous forms of sampling because the population that we're trying to get might be really hard to obtain. in my discipline of communication studies, we have a field called health communication. And a lot of folks that are in that might work with vulnerable populations like people who are HIV or AIDS positive, or cancer patients, or other types of chronic illnesses. It's much harder to find a truly random sample of those types of folks. And so as a result, you might really dive into the experiences of this group of people who have a common experience. Well, that's purposive sampling, not so much convenient sampling. And so that would be much more permissible than just, say, finding a couple of dozen college students who are in your class and offering them extra credit to be a part of your study, which is a barely defensible research design for most types of scholarship. So that's what you should do if you're doing a human participant research. If you're doing more content analysis, discourse analysis, things that have data sets that are not people, but are instead artifacts, then you should be telling me, again, inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you're doing a thematic analysis of newspapers. Well, how did you pick the newspapers? What was it, a level of circulation? Was it the ones that ran this type of story or didn't? Was it based on geography? They're from this type of nation and not that type of nation. And then from there, again, I should have as much information as I can about the sources. If it's a newspaper, tell me about those sources. Tell me about the companies that produce them. Who's the owners? Because all of those things are going to matter in the different types of framings or priming that might go on with the type of news that's being created by those particular sources. All those things together then are telling me not just what the artifacts are, but why you chose those artifacts. Same thing with the human participants. It's not just about who they are. It's about why you chose those people. What made it a purposeful research design, not just convenience. So this leads to the second section, which is the procedures. So how did you get the data? Did you do interviews? Did you do ethnography? Did you do focus groups? What steps did you take in order for you to generate this data? If you're doing something like interviews or focus groups, then in those cases, you need to tell me, were they semi-structured, unstructured, highly structured? And then from there, you can tell me how you interacted with the participants based on that. So if it was highly structured, I did structured interviews. And so I asked primarily close-ended questions of my participants, as opposed to I did semi-structured or unstructured interviews where I had a conversation with participants and through that conversation ended up asking questions that generated data. Those are two different things and they serve different purposes. A highly structured close-ended interview where you ask a lot of yes/no questions or questions that have definite answers because they're close-ended, that is probably not going to lend itself to a lot of rapport building. That's a research design, a procedure that you probably would use for surface level types of information. If I were to ask a person and do research, again, using health communication as an example, with a person who has a terminal illness, right, a terminal diagnosis with cancer, me just walking up to them and pumping them for information with a set of 10 close-ended questions is probably not going to yield that much useful data, as opposed to really taking the time to build rapport through a conversation, get to know them, really sort of build those connections in order to really facilitate this interview process, which is much more in line with an unstructured or semi-structured approach. The last thing that you're going to want to do, especially if you're doing interviews or focus groups, put in sample questions from your interview schedule or from your focus group schedule to show your reader the types of questions that you asked your participants. You don't want to add all of your questions. That's not going to be very helpful, but you do want to add 2 or 3 of the questions that you felt like were most beneficial to you obtaining data that was useful for your overarching research question or research purpose of your paper. So again, providing your reader with some access to the things that you did in order for you to build credibility with them about the types of knowledge claims that you're making. At this point, you have your participants and your procedures. And so we're now going to talk about the third section that your qualitative research report needs, which is your data analysis. So in the data analysis section, this is where you're going to tell your reader what kind of analysis did you perform on the data? How did you make meaning of the data now that you've gathered it using whatever procedure that you did? So here you might have common ways of analyzing your data like thematic analysis, narrative analysis, elaborative analysis or whatever it is. And here, let me just take a quick second to recommend the work of Johnny Saldana, who has books on different ways of analyzing and coding data. And what I really enjoy about his work is that not only does he do a really good job of situating those different modes of analysis in their own unique traditions, but he also shows data and demonstrates to a reader what it might look like to analyze data from a particular way. How, for example, values, attitudes, and beliefs coding might look different than emotion coding, which might look different than taxonomic coding. I would recommend his books as really good places to start if you're wondering, how am I going to show my reader how I made meaning of my data? And here it's really important that you are demonstrating to your reader all the steps that you took, because as qualitative researchers, we don't have the same types of replicability and validity claims that quantitative scholars do. It's incumbent on you as a writer to convince me as a reader that you didn't just cherry pick your data, that the way that you approached your data was systematic. You built a coding book. You actually used that coding book. If you had multiple people on the project, that you had some way of addressing disagreements in coding. And you don't have to necessarily do that in some sort of pseudo-quantitative way and like do inter-coder reliability, although if you want to do that, that's fine. But even if you're not going to do that more social science route, you still need to be able to say, okay, if author A and author B saw different things, well, what did you do? Did you discuss it till you reached consensus? Did you obtain a third person just so that way they could help you with the coding and be the tiebreaker, right? What did you do in order to make sense of the data? I think that novice or early career qualitative researchers, even if they say that they used some sort of analysis method, they probably just looked for what was the most common in the data. They didn't really do a very good job of following the actual method of analysis that they say that they had. As a result, they don't write a whole bunch here because there's not really a there. Other times, I think that some scholars don't write a whole lot there because they think, overwriting this makes me seem defensive and like I'm trying to write like a pseudo-quantitative scholar, which is kind of counter to a lot of the theoretical and philosophical assumptions of qualitative research. And while I'm sympathetic in some ways to that second type of person, at the end of the day, to me, the data analysis section is where you can communicate to your reader, hey, I didn't cherry pick things. There was a step-by-step process here that led me to my findings. And by following that, I'm not necessarily saying that you'll see the exact same thing that I saw, because again, we're not dealing with a reliability thing here, but you should be able to see the same things that I saw and trust that even the things that you can't see, because that data ultimately didn't get put into the results section, right? Because you just put your exemplar pieces in there. But even the data that you didn't see would be data that agrees with the themes that I've said are in there, because I've done such a good job in the data analysis section of showing you how I came up with these themes that you end up trusting me even whenever you can't see everything. So those three things are the most important. You need to have participants, procedures, data analysis every time without fail. You might call them something different. You might put that information in one rather than the other. I see people do these in different ways. I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of whatever for that. But you have to have this information in every qualitative report without fail. There are two other sections that you might have depending on the type of research that you're doing and the type of outlet that you are submitting to. The first one is settings or context. It is necessary to account for the settings and the context. Otherwise, you are freezing these participants in time and making it seem like their cultural practices, which are specific and particular, are somehow generalizable to all types of people. So for example, I recently read a piece, How Students Negotiate Feedback from Their Instructors Whenever the Feedback Requests that the student improve in some way. So a type of feedback we might think of as inherently face-threatening to a student. And the paper's good. It's got a really good theoretical framework. It's got a really cool design. But the entire time I'm thinking to myself, I can only imagine that students who are attending a school where most of the student body is from well-off families that are high socioeconomic status, where college attainment is something that is normal for that family, that a school where the student body is like that, they might feel much more normal for them to advocate for themselves, to talk back to faculty, to disagree with feedback. By the same token, faculty might have different strategies for giving feedback for that type of person, as opposed to an institution that serves, let's say, primarily first-generation students that are primarily low socioeconomic status. So much of the research shows that affluent students are much more likely to argue, beg, borrow, and steal their way into a good grade. And first-generation college students and low socioeconomic students are much more likely to take and internalize negative feedback and not say anything about it to the instructor because they don't feel like they have the cultural or social capital to speak back. But none of that's in the paper, right? I would never know if these students came from a 4-year public flagship or from a community college or from Harvard or from anywhere else because none of that context is written into the paper. Well, that's a problem, right? These students are not suspended in amber, and they're certainly not generalizable from a sample of 30 interviews done at one or even half a dozen colleges. You need to show that your data is particular to the socio-historical context in which it arises. The only time that you wouldn't do that is if you're doing qualitative data gathering in order to generate survey instruments. In that case, your qualitative stuff is in service of a quantitative project and is in service of generalizability. But if your whole spiel is I do qualitative research because it's about understanding the particular, and then you don't show me the particular, then what's the point of your research? So settings is oftentimes, not always, but is oftentimes an important part of any qualitative research project. The final section that you might have in a qualitative research report is a reflexivity statement. Now, I know some folks are going to say that should always be in there. That should have been with the other 3 that you said always need to be in there. Well, I mean, it kind of depends on what type of qualitative research that you're doing. So if you're doing qualitative research that is very much located in the critical cultural side of philosophy, then absolutely a reflexivity statement is very important. On the other hand, again, if you're doing qualitative research that is more in line with social science norms, especially if you're doing qualitative research in service of creating a survey instrument, then you would not have a reflexivity statement. So it really is kind of genre dependent here. Are you on the more critical cultural side or are you on the more social sciencey side? So if you are, though, wanting to write a reflexivity statement, this is the place where you describe yourself and your identities and how that might have affected or influenced the type of research project that you're doing. If you are a white middle-class academic and you're doing research with Black urban youth that are low socioeconomic status, and that's a power imbalance. Like from the very get-go, you should have been thinking to yourself, okay, the topic that I'm interested in, why am I interested in it? What do I get out of this? What do they get out of this? Who am I to be the one who does this project? What does it mean for my body to be in that space with those bodies? How does the power imbalance between me and them influence or affect the types of questions that I ask or the types of answers that they might have given? And ultimately, what did I do in order to address those things? Now, in this case, whenever I say address those things, what I do not mean is how did I make myself objective? How did I stay neutral? Because as a qualitative researcher, especially from a critical or cultural standpoint, you cannot be neutral. You cannot be objective. From the very get-go, you are a partial interpreting subject who is in this space, and there is no place that is safe or neutral for you to sort of epistemologically retreat to. Instead, it's important that you are showing me as a reader that you were aware of those things and that you did things to address that. Did you encourage the participants in your study to read the things that you had written about them and give them some sort of power over the final project? So if they said, hey, you quoted me, and now that I read this, I'm not comfortable either with you quoting me, or I'm not comfortable with the way that you've interpreted and analyzed my quote, and they say, I want you to take that out. Did you do that? Did you allow them that space and that power? Because again, the more power imbalance that you had between you and your participants, the more that might have affected how things were going on, the more that you need to make sure that you are doing things that empower your participants and try to level that power. Now, at the end of the day, you are the one who writes and they are the ones who are written about. And you should not try to downplay or obfuscate that relationship, because doing that really is a dereliction of your responsibility as a researcher and really just goes to maybe making yourself feel better about that situation, but doesn't really address the actual power imbalance. In a reflexivity statement, then, you might have a couple of paragraphs where you walk your reader through this idea of here are all the ways that I tried to make sure that I was aware of and where possible addressed these different dynamics based on identity, geography, location, history, all those different types of things. If you're doing more social science type of qualitative research, you may not do this. So for example, I have a research project that I published with a coworker of mine about how first-year college students utilized information literacy skills to create persuasive speeches in the public speaking class. Okay, that doesn't really require a whole lot of reflexivity. That's not a huge power imbalance there. I mean, there is a little bit between instructors and students, but for the most part, the whole purpose of that was to identify these information literacy strategies. We're not asking them questions that might touch on mental health issues, trauma in their childhood, racism, sexism, any of those things where identity and power then become far more salient. Instead, we were developing this so that way in the end we could develop a quick survey instrument and we could give that to our students and know, hey, here are the things that we know are effective or ineffective. Are you doing these things? Okay, you are. Great. Keep doing that. If you're not, okay, then as an instructor, we can intervene into this situation and we can do a better job of teaching you information literacy skills. So in that case, a reflexivity statement would not have really made any sense. Depending on the philosophical traditions in which you're drawing on, you may or may not need that section. As we're wrapping up, I just want to reemphasize how important it is that you have a good method section in your qualitative report. The whole purpose of qualitative research is to do this deep, nuanced understanding of people's life worlds and to really show that to a reader in a way that helps them build a credible portrait of how other people live their lives. Your method section then is the place that convinces your reader that you did everything right, that you did all things possible to make sure that you found the right people, you utilized the right procedures, you analyzed the data in a careful way, and show that the context was important and that you were sensitive to identity and power as it related to that research project. If you can show that to a reader and convince your reader that you knew those things were important, that you did them well, then you've taken a really big step in convincing your reader that you are a credible and trustworthy person whenever you're showing them the results and findings of your research. So, as always, I'm interested in the things that you're doing to address this week's topic. So tell me the tips, tricks, habits, rituals, things that you're doing in order to develop rigorous qualitative methods sections in your research. I'm always looking for advice that I can give to my students and my clients, and I'm also happy to give you a shout out next time I talk about this on my podcast. Also, if you're interested in developing your writing more, whether that's through your thesis, dissertation, journal articles, whatever it might be, I'm always interested in taking on new clients. I enjoy the writing process. I enjoy editing. I enjoy being a writing coach. So reach out to me. I'm happy to do a consultation with you and see if there's an opportunity to develop a more lasting relationship across weeks or even months in order for you to achieve the goals that you have in your research. So thank you again, and I'll see you in next week's episode. Hey writers, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant ideas shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. If you have the time, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the podcast, leave a positive review, assign this to your classes, or share it with a colleague. All those things help get the word out and let me know what I can do to make this podcast the best resource for you. Also, if you'd like to set up a time to chat with me about your next big idea, then you can find my information in the podcast description where you can schedule a time. So until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.